Hello, everybody. This video will be about the Industrial Revolution. As you watch the video, these are the questions that I would like you to consider. What is the Industrial Revolution? How had the European economy changed from 1750 to 1900? What political, cultural, economic, and geographic factors encourage industrialization, and what were the effects of industrialization on society? These are the key terms that you should be able to define by the end of the video. Industrial revolution, mechanized production, the factory system, steam power, and urbanization. So let's begin by talking about what it is we mean when we say the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is probably one of the most important events in human history since the Agricultural Revolution. And as you should know, the Agricultural Revolution is that transition from human beings as hunter-gatherers to human beings as farmers. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, society transforms from a bunch of farmers to a more urban and global society. So what the Industrial Revolution is a sort of takeoff of economic growth that is fueled by social, economic, and technological changes. The Industrial Revolution is characterized by a couple of big changes, and perhaps the most obvious is mechanization. And this means that we are replacing human or animal power with the power of the machine. So before the Industrial Revolution, everything was done either with muscles of either a human being or an animal, but after the Industrial Revolution, we have machines doing most of the hard work. On top of that, there is the exponential increase in production. Each breakthrough from the Industrial Revolution leads to further advances. Urbanization is also a big thing that happens. Partly because of mechanization, agriculture becomes more efficient, so millions of peasants can begin to move to cities to work in factories. Finally, there's this trend known as rationalization, where traditional forms of economic activity are eliminated and replaced by new, more productive and efficient forms. So we're getting rid of the old ways of making stuff and introducing increasingly efficient ways of making stuff. Now, the basic timeline here is that the investor revolution begins in the late 1700s in Britain and kind of stays in Britain from 1782 to 1820. Then from 1820 to the early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe, North America, and Japan. So all of these places are industrialized by 1900, but the rest of the world remains non-industrial. After 1900, though, the rest of the world slowly starts to catch up to these industrialized places. But really, not a lot of parts of the world are still really industrialized, which is one of the reasons why there's so much inequality today between the first world, so Europe, Japan, and North America, and the third world. Thing that I want you to think about when we talk about the Industrial Revolution is that it represents a whole new phase of human existence. So the first kind of economic phase of humanity was the hunter-gatherer era, and this is by far the longest period where for almost 500,000 years human beings basically just lived off the land. All work and labor was performed by humans, and all products were made by hand. Populations were small and limited by their natural environment, and it was really hard to acquire very much wealth. It was also difficult to organize people into anything larger than a small village. Now, this begins to change in the agricultural era, which begins in 10,000 BCE and lasts until the Industrial Revolution, so around 1800. In the agricultural era, all labor is performed by either humans or animals because now we've domesticated animals. Now, Agriculture is really important here because what it does is it allows people to learn how to alter their environment, the environment in which they live, in order to start supporting more people in higher populations. For example, they learn to cut down the jungle to plant corn to feed a growing population. Now, what larger populations do is that they lead to more wealth and more organization. And that leads us to our current economic era. It's the one that we're still in, and it's called the industrial era, and that's from 1800 to today. Now, the industrial era is the era where lots of labor and work is not performed by humans, but by machines. Think about all of the stuff that you own. Most of that wasn't made by a person, it was made by a machine. So now we can massively alter our environment. We have machines to plow fields and remove mountains and all sorts of things, which help sustain our huge populations. So technological advancements lead to a growing massive population and a vast amount of wealth that tends to be concentrated usually in the hands of a small percentage of wealthy people. It also leads to a highly organized society. So that's the industrial era that we're still in today. So let's take a look at Western Europe in 1750. That's Western Europe before the Industrial Revolution. So in Europe, basically at this point, peasants or rural farmers represent the majority of the population. 90% of the population in most countries were peasants. And the reason why so many people were peasants was that each peasant was barely able to produce enough to feed himself. And he was only able to pass on a small surplus of food to the people who couldn't farm. This meant you could only support a really small population of urban producers and religious and political elites. Also, most manufactured products are produced by hand, and peasants made a lot of their own stuff. So they spun their own cloth, they made their own rope, their own shoes, basic tools and stuff like that. But special goods would be produced by skilled craftsmen in the cities. So metal tools and furniture, pottery, and luxury items would be made in the cities. And there wasn't a lot of this stuff. Now, the reason that these specialized products were more hard to find was because cities remained really small, and all of this stuff was made by hand, so it was pretty hard to come by, and it was also very expensive. Now, like I already mentioned, the cities were really tiny at the time, but they were growing. Now, on the one hand, they're pretty small because there's not a lot of extra food and it's difficult to support large urban populations if there's not enough food to go around. But on the other hand, cities are beginning to get a little bigger because of the increase in world trade. Now let's compare Western Europe in 1750 to Western Europe in 1900, after most of Europe has industrialized. Now there are huge cities in Europe, and they're all over the place. Cities go from representing less than 10% of the population to representing about 1/3 of the total population in Europe. And the reason for this is mainly because of advances in farming that allowed farmers to support more people. Now, this has to do with certain technologies, but also new techniques that come about during the industrial era. But some big cities represent big problems. These new urban spaces have issues like pollution and crime and unsanitary conditions. But cities also lead to vast amounts of wealth because these cities are now producing tons and tons of valuable stuff that can be sold all over the world. Now, most of the things being produced in the cities are made with machines. Machines are used in agriculture and in industry to kind of substitute for human labor. And this leads to huge increases of productivity, more stuff for everybody, and more wealth for society as a whole. There's also mechanized transport. So before, if you wanted to go anywhere, you either had to walk or use a horse to take you there. But now, using mechanization, the power of steam, basically powered by coal in trains and steamships, allows for people to move faster than ever before. This increase in travel leads to an increase in trade. And basically, all of this is possible because of a phenomenon known as self-sustaining growth. Basically, each advancements lead to more advancements. So now that you have an understanding of what the Industrial Revolution is, I want to take a look at why the Industrial Revolution begins in England. So around 1780, things really start to take off in Great Britain. And basically, from this point on, life in Great Britain is never the same. A lot of people seem to think that the Industrial Revolution is just kind of a matter of some new inventions, things like railroads and factories, but it's really a lot more complicated. It's not just a story of the technology. In fact, the necessary technology for the Industrial Revolution, all of the stuff that they're actually using, had been around since the Scientific Revolution. Britain is special not just because of their advanced technology, but because of the way it uses their technology. So to explain why all of this stuff happens in Britain, we actually need to look at a number of things. We need to look at their geographic factors and their political and cultural factors, Britain's economic factors, and their technological factors. So all of these factors combine in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which results in a snowball effect of increasing production and growth. And that production and growth eventually spreads to the rest of Europe in the 1800s. Let's take a look at the geographic factors that made England a perfect place for the Industrial Revolution to begin. First of all, England was a well-populated island with lots of rivers and canals, and this was important for two reasons. The first reason was that it protected England from invasions. And what this meant was that because Britain was safe from invasions from other countries, it was able to spend more of its national wealth on trade and industry. Also, the fact that England was a small island made it really easy to transport goods. And basically, the reason transport is so important for industrialization is that factories really don't make any sense unless you can transport the stuff that you make in the factory to the people who want to buy that stuff. Back in the 1700s, this was pretty difficult because there weren't cars and there weren't railroads. So the only real efficient way to transport stuff from a factory was to transport it on water. And one fact that really makes this very clear is that before the invention of railroads, it cost as much money to ship stuff all the way across the Atlantic Ocean as it cost to ship stuff 30 miles over land. So fortunately for England, there was no place that was more than 20 miles away from navigable water, things like rivers and canals and ports. This meant that stuff that was produced in England could be shipped almost anywhere in the world simply by taking it downriver and shipping it across the ocean. The other important geographic factor that influenced industry in Great Britain was that it had accessible coal deposits. So coal is a very accessible fossil fuel that can be burned at incredibly high temperatures. The reason coal had become so important in England was not because of the Industrial Revolution, but because by 1700, almost all of the trees in England had been cut down. So because they cut down all the trees, English people needed a new source to keep warm in the winter. So they burned coal in their houses instead of trees. Coal would later become important for the Industrial Revolution because it would be burned to power the machines that would run the English factories. It provided cheap, reliable fuel for mechanization. Another important economic factor was the development of agriculture in Great Britain. So the reason agriculture is so important is without really efficient agriculture, you can't support big cities because for every person in the city, you need food to be produced in the countryside that can feed that person because that person in the city is not actually growing their own food. And this happens in Great Britain during the century before the Industrial Revolution from 1700 to 1800. There are a few main factors that lead to a huge increase in agricultural output. One is this movement called enclosure, which is basically a tendency for rich English landlords to buy up all of the land and to kick poor peasants off of the land. What this means is that all of the agricultural lands that were kind of shared by poorer peasants are now owned by a single wealthy farmer who seeks to use that land to make as much money as possible. This, of course, is not so good for the poor farmers, but it's really good for England and in general because it results in a much more efficient agricultural production because the rich farmers can use the land more efficiently than all of the small farmers before. Now, they've also figured out the idea of crop rotation and fodder crops. And this is a little complicated, but basically the idea is that some crops that you use to feed your animals, like clover, actually make the soil better. They return nutrients to the soil over time. So what farmers figure out is that they're going to grow normal crops like wheat on half of the land and half of their fields, they're going to grow fodder crops like clover that actually make their soil better. So not only does this lead to better soil, it allows farmers to support more livestock because they can feed the clover to their animals. So this means you have better soil, more animals, and that means that there's more manure, also known as fertilizer. So they can use this manure from the animals to fertilize their fields, which means there's even more stuff that can be produced on these fields. And it's basically just this feedback loop that results in a huge increase in productivity on English lands. So the end result of these big agricultural breakthroughs was a huge growth in agricultural production and then a huge growth in population because more food equals more babies. So by 1800, England and England's population had almost doubled from 5 million to 9 million. Now, what this means is that there's not enough room in the countryside, so poorer people begin to flood the cities. And what this meant was that there was suddenly a supply of cheap labor in the cities. More people were freed up to work in factories. Another economic factor is Britain's trade and industry. The Industrial Revolution really grew out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy of the 18th century. Like I said before, England is a small island that has a lot of waterways. This led to the growth of the Royal Navy and the development of ports, which provide protection from foreign invasion. But they also later aid Britain's commercial empire. As a leading trading nation, Britain could sell the stuff it made at home in its factories all around the world. Britain was also a colonial empire. It had colonies and ports all across the globe. And this colonial empire gives Britain access to raw materials that were needed for the development of many industries. Say, for example, there is a factory in England that specializes in producing shirts and clothing, and they need cotton from abroad. They could take cotton from some of their plantations in the colonies in the New World, send it over to England to use in their factories, and transform that cotton into a shirt that they could then send all around the world and sell it to whoever wanted it. Britain basically had an unlimited demand for the stuff that it made. On top of this, Britain already had a capitalist tradition in which rich people in England would invest their money in order to make more money. So if you inherited, say, $10,000, rather than having a party or building a big mansion, what a British person would do is they would use that $10,000 to buy a ship and turn that $10,000 into $20,000 over time by using that ship to trade. And then they would use that $20,000 and build a factory and then turn that $20,000 into $1 million. So the idea is that they would use their money to generate more money. And this was a tradition that dated way back in England, and that was still going strong when the Industrial Revolution started. And perhaps what was most important at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was the textile industry. Basically, everybody in the world wears clothes. And so because Britain had access to the world market, if they could learn to make clothes cheaply and well, they could sell an infinite number of clothes all over the world. And so we're going to see in the next slide how the cotton textiles industry kind of begins the Industrial Revolution and kicks off this snowball effect of economic growth. So now we're going to look at key breakthroughs in England during the first stage of the Industrial Revolution from 1760 to 1800. Now, in this first stage, there are three big things. One of them is the factory system. And this is not so much a technology, but more a change in the way labor is organized. So before the Industrial Revolution, things like clothes were made in what is called the cottage industry. This is basically where merchants from cities would provide a rural family with raw materials, and then this family would produce a finished or semi-finished product and send it back to the merchant for payment. This is called the cottage industry or the putting out system. This old system is now replaced by the factory system in Britain, where basically instead of people making stuff in their homes, all the workers are gathered together in factories, and complex tasks are broken down into simple tasks, which means that unskilled people can work together to create one complicated thing. So for example, it's like one person will wash the wool, one person will spin the wool, one person will weave the wool, one person will then sew the wool into a shirt. So all this together makes for a huge increase in production, even with less skilled laborers. On top of the factory system, we begin to see mechanization. And mechanization is basically where you invent machines to replace human beings at certain jobs. And the first place where you see widespread mechanization is in the production of textiles or cotton and wool cloth. So you see the machines called the water frame and the spinning jenny and the power loom that take over old human tasks like spinning cotton into thread and then weaving the cotton into cloth. And instead of humans, these machines do it faster and more effectively. And what this does is it vastly increases the amount of cotton and wool cloth that can be made in a single factory. And it decreases the price of all of this stuff that can then be sold out into the world. Now, these machines are originally powered either by hand, by horses, or by water, but later they'll be replaced by steam power, which is the third most important breakthrough of the early Industrial Revolution. So the steam engine really becomes the kind of most efficient and effective way to get things done. And this was James Watts's steam engine, which was invented around 1775. And basically what this machine does is it burns coal to boil water, and then the water is used to create a piston full of pressurized steam. And this will move the piston because the pressure forces the piston up, and then it turns and pushes in a crank arm that can turn a wheel. And the turning of this wheel can then be used to power any number of machines. Now we're going to look at the key breakthroughs of sort of the second part of the Industrial Revolution, which is from 1800 to 1850. And this can really be thought of as the Transportation Revolution. So basically what happens here is they take the steam engine and apply it to transportation technology. And the two things we see that come out of this are railroads and steamships. And both of these methods drastically increase the speed of travel, and therefore they increase the speed of trade and communication, which boosts production. Because if you can't transport stuff, then there's no reason to make it in the factories. So steamships made two-way river travel possible and travel on the high seas possible, and many private companies quickly organized to build rail lines. So this greatly reduces the cost of shipping and results in a growing regional and national market, increasing productivity. Finally, you also see a mass production of iron, and this is huge because it transforms basically every aspect of society. Before mass production of iron, iron was a very rare and precious metal, but afterwards, iron is cheap and common and can be used for everything. The reason that there was this really big shift towards mass iron production was because of a huge investment in railroad production that leads to this increased demand for iron production. It becomes cheap and plentiful and then leads to advances in construction and engineering. As a result of all of these breakthroughs, by 1840, the combination of the factory system, mechanized production, steam power, advanced transportation, and world trade had totally transformed the British economy in both positive and negative ways. On the positive side, Britain becomes the leading producer in the world of textiles, coal, and iron. And Britain is also able to sell its goods all around the world, bringing back natural resources that it needs for its factories, but also bringing back huge profits to the factory owners who are making all of this stuff. So Britain becomes incredibly wealthy and has a greater productive capacity than any other nation in the world. But on the negative side, we see rapid and unplanned urbanization, which leads to diseases, slums, and pollution. We see inequality where poor Britons lack the funds to invest in factories, so most of these profits go to a small number of wealthy investors. And finally, it leads to a lot of suffering for the new urban working class who work long hours in dangerous working conditions for minimum wages. By the 1850s, Great Britain had become the world's first and richest industrial nation. Britain was capable of producing 1/2 of the world's coal and manufactured goods and most of the world's cotton. The Industrial Revolution spreads to the rest of Europe, although at slightly different times. It first spreads to Belgium, and then France, and then the German states. These nations' governments were active in encouraging the development of industry, and they provided funds for roads, canals, and railroads. So now I want you to start thinking about how industrialization affects Europe's place in the world. Basically, industrialized nations, places like Europe, the United States, and Japan, have a huge advantage over non-industrialized nations. They have more people, more money, more guns, and basically more anything that you would need when it comes to taking over places. And so on top of this, industrialized nations need natural resources from other countries in order to keep feeding their overgrowing factories. Think of England as a tiny little island, and it's kind of run out of its own natural resources, and it needs to go get resources from other places. So England begins to set up a global empire. And what this means is that industrial Europe has both the power and the motive to set up a global empire. And basically from 1860 till the end of World War II, Europe goes on to divide the rest of the world into a huge few empires where rich nations are competing for territory for the most amount of natural resources. So one important thing that this leads to is that it leads to lasting suffering and instability in parts of the world that are colonized. And that helps to explain the big divide between rich nations and poor nations in the world today. So the key takeaways that you need from this video are the experiences of everyday life were shaped by industrialization depending on the level of industrial development in a particular location. And Great Britain established its industrial dominance through the mechanization of textile production, iron and steel production, and new transportations in conjunction with uniquely favorable political and social climates. Thanks for sticking through this long video.